June 1908, Emily Pankhurst led 30,000 women through Hyde Park in London to demand the vote. In March 1930, Mahatma Gandhi set off towards the sea on his Salt March to demand an end to unjust colonial taxes and an end of the British occupation of India. In 1963, Martin Luther King began his Birmingham campaign to end segregation in the American South and pull down the corrupt edifice of Jim Crow. This is how people respond to injustice when their rights are violated. They don't sit back, they get together, they organize, they take to the streets. In this episode, we're going to look at the notion of civil resistance. But before we dive in, remember to like, subscribe, and share. In the next few videos, I'm going to talk about civil resistance extensively. So before I do that, it's really important that we know exactly what it is we're talking about. The idea of civil resistance has flourished in the 19th and 20th centuries through the works of people like Henry David Thoreau, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and more recently, Gene Sharp. It's been forged in the experience of the struggle against colonialism, racism, slavery, and patriarchy. I like the idea of civil resistance that Kurt Schoch gives us. He talks about sustained, extraordinary, nonviolent political action engaged in by civilians against an asymmetric power source that will use violence against them. Now that's a lot in a little, so let's break down the necessary conditions. There are 6 of them. The first condition is that this is a sustained political campaign. Civil resistance isn't a bread riot. A bread riot might be a response to injustice, but it's not organized. It's not directed at changing agrarian policy explicitly, though it might produce that change over time. The second condition is extremely important, and that's that this is non-violent and deliberately non-violent. Now, there's a huge range of reasons why non-violence might be the chosen tactic. It could be that people are principled pacifists. They believe that violence is always wrong. But it could equally be that violence is just tactically wrong. And people would say, well, if violence was going to work, get me my Molotov cocktail. But it's not going to work in these circumstances. Now, there might be sporadic episodes of violence, right? There might be instances of someone letting a car on fire in a protest, but that is not a direct part of the organized protest. It is a fringe element. It's important to remember that civil resistance is civil. It still maintains the idea that we are living a common life and that violence is a bridge too far. The third condition is that civil resistance is extraordinary. It is an irregular form of politics. It doesn't work into our normal political framework, and it's usually because it breaks the law in some sense, or it violates profoundly held social mores. So when we think about the Salt March or the Birmingham campaign, we're talking about actions that broke the law, and people like Gandhi and MLK, they experienced sort of the coercive power of the state as a reaction to this extraordinary form of politics. The suffragette case, and certainly the suffragettes did sort of break the law at times, but sometimes they didn't. But it was still extraordinary because the mores of the time were shocked by the idea that women would be political, that they would want to vote. An organized march for women's rights in 1908 was very, very subversive. And that, I think, pushes it into the extraordinary side of politics. The fourth condition is very simple. It is that we're talking about civilians. This is not a military force engaged in political action. It is civilians, it is citizens, it is people not in uniform. The fifth condition is that there is an asymmetry of power, that those engaging in civil resistance are weaker than those who they are protesting against. Think about Gandhi, right? Leading the movement for Indian independence against the world's largest and most powerful empire. One party is significantly stronger than the other in this circumstance. The final condition is perhaps the most complicated. Putting it simply, people engaged in civil resistance expect violence to be used against them, even though they won't use violence themselves. They expect the beneficiaries of injustice to use any means to protect their interest. It's important to make a distinction here, though. Violence is uncontrolled and arbitrary in the case of civil resistance. We're not talking about police action that is within the bounds of the rule of law and democratic accountability. So it's not all forms of state coercion. It is this uncontrolled form of state coercion that people are anticipating when they engage in civil resistance. That effectively sums up what civil resistance is. If those 6 conditions are met, then we can say a social movement is engaged in civil resistance. Why have I decided to make a video enumerating the various necessary conditions for something to be civil resistance? Well, you know that I love precision, but at the same time, I want to draw a really strict cleavage between ordinary democratic protest and civil resistance, because oftentimes the two get conflated. Think about Occupy Wall Street. So back in 2011, a lot of people were really pissed off about how Wall Street and the banks were basically given a free pass for the Great Recession. And they occupied Zuccotti Park in New York City and had various other off-branches throughout the world. They engaged in an occupation. They tried to stop the functioning of a major center of global finance. Is this civil resistance? I don't think so. I think it's ordinary democratic politics of protest, which is perfectly fine. In fact, I fully endorse it. But let's not get carried away. So why isn't it civil resistance? Well, because of the NYPD. And look, I'm no lover of the NYPD, but when they cleared out Zuccotti Park, there wasn't uncontrolled violence. It was police action constrained by the rule of law. No one disappeared into the penal system, never to be seen again. No one was murdered by the cops with no consequences for the officers. It was rough, there was tear gas, it wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't uncontrolled. Why am I harping on this? Well, because oftentimes we appropriate the discourse of resistance for ordinary democratic politics. And I understand why, hashtag resistance is effective. It's good marketing. It draws people in. People like to resist injustice. It feels good to fight for your rights. But we need to be careful that we're not devaluing the actions of people who are engaged in this sort of resistance against uncontrolled violence. When I was writing my book, I became acutely aware that a lot of the things we take for granted in the global north are not available in the global south when it comes to the politics we can engage in. If you're a trade unionist in the global north, you're fine, usually. Don't get me wrong. People are fighting every day to unionize. I'm a member of a union. If you're watching this, join a union. What, you don't like better pay? You don't like better working conditions? This is what unions do. You don't like the weekend? Well, unions got them for you. I love unions. But I don't consider it a form of civil resistance to join a union. Now, in the global south, union organizers and union members face extreme violence. Union leaders often disappear, never to be heard of again. I'm not talking about Jimmy Hoffa style. I'm talking because of their politics. Same can be said for indigenous peoples. Indigenous organizers in the global south face violence, not just from the government, but from private corporations. Indeed, I won't limit this to the global south. Indigenous communities in the global north, in places like America, Canada, Australia, know that the police will respond to them in a way that they won't respond to, say, someone like me protesting. I can remember when I was a kid, there was a lot of protests from the First Nations in my home province of Ontario. People were very angry at the failure to honor treaties, the expropriation of Indigenous land, and there was occupations happening. In a place called Ipperwash, there was a long-standing occupation by Indigenous activists, and the Premier of Ontario, Mike Harris, ordered the OPP, the Ontario Provincial Police, for those of you not in the know, to storm out the protesters. He said that he wanted to get a big fucking army together to clear them all out. And by the end of the day, the police had shot an Indigenous protester, Dudley George, dead. This is something that doesn't generally happen when white people, middle-class people, take to the streets to protest. So what I'm getting at here is that protest and civil resistance are often really finely divided. Sometimes it's very subjective. I know that I'm rarely going to face uncontrolled police violence. Indigenous peoples can't say the same thing. And it's important to really emphasize why this matters. Because in democratic politics, we often appropriate the idea of resistance. Go on Twitter right now, put in #resistance. You're going to find a whole lot of ordinary politics appropriating the term. And I get it, I really do. It is effective. It's a good way of organizing people. It's good political marketing, but it blurs a line. And as a political philosopher, I like my lines really sharp, really clear. That way we can say, these people are engaged in resistance. There might be a severe injustice happening versus these people are engaged in ordinary politics. There might be things going wrong in society, but it hasn't become manifestly unjust yet. So we know what civil resistance is now. It's a form of extraordinary politics, peaceful, undertaken by civilians in the face of violence, trying to effect change against injustice. The next question I want to ask is whether this is an effective way to fight global poverty and global inequality. But we're going to have to save that for the next video. Thanks for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, and share. And take care, everyone.
I love you.